You might think that some of the things psychologists study are kind of obvious. They're not things that are mind-blowingly cool. They study behavior. We all have our own intuitions about behavior. We all have our own ways that we think it works, and this is something that can kind of be a misconception about psychology, that they're confirming things that we already know about ourselves. One kind of funny example is there was a recent study that studied the weekend effect. That's what they called it in the paper, and there were some researchers at the University of Rochester. What they concluded was that regardless of whatever job you have, people are happier on the weekend than they are during the week. And this is something that your personal experience has probably confirmed over and over again. You might not think that this is something that scientists need to study. Well, in this case, the obvious hypothesis is that the weekend is more fun than the non-weekend. While in this case this was proved to be true, there are a lot of instances in psychology where this hasn't been true. Some of the coolest experiments have been when people have thought things to be obvious, but they've turned out not to be. This would be like if your weekend effect experiment actually proves that people were happier during the work week. That would be the magnitude of some of these experiments that disprove the hypothesis. That seems crazy. It isn't true in this case, but in some cases, it is. As an example of this, let's say your friend decides to design an experiment where he's going to see if people get an incredibly easy question wrong just because everyone else in the room is answering wrong as well. He's going to give two cards. The first card is going to have a line on it, and the second card is going to have 3 lines on it of different lengths. Now, one of them is the same length as the one on the card. These lines are labeled A, B, and C. So he's going to ask a bunch of people in the room which line is the same as the line on the first card. This is the most obvious, easy question ever. A 3-year-old can answer this. If he can see, he's going to be able to answer this question. But what your friend's going to do is he's going to have everyone else in the room answer wrong. If the answer is B, then he's going to have everyone else say C. Let's see if our subject will also say C. This is a real experiment. The guy who designed it, his name is Solomon Asch, and he thought that people wouldn't do this. Again, they can see that B is clearly the answer, and they're not going to get it wrong even if they're pressured by other people. He thought that he would find this was true. People got it wrong all the time. Only about 24% of the subjects didn't say the wrong answer on average. They would do 3 trials each. 24% didn't say the wrong answer. Everyone else gave the wrong answer at least once because the effect of having all these people in a row saying the wrong answer over and over again was so powerful that they said the wrong answer. If Solomon Asch just said, "This is something obvious that people can see and they're not going to get it wrong," we would never know this. We would never know how powerful people's peers are and how powerful peer pressure is. And that was an experiment where it was good that it got done and it turned out not to be so obvious. That's a way in which psychology can be useful. It's true of psychology what you see over and over again because it's true that we have ideas of how things work and how our brains work. We don't actually have any idea a lot of the time. And there's another study that shows this perfectly. It's about how people misattribute why they're feeling the way they're feeling. In this particular study, the researchers decided to have men go out on a bridge. They had 2 bridges, one of which is kind of shaky like one of those wooden Indiana Jones bridges where you figure a plank may fall out in the middle. And one of them is really sturdy. It's not going anywhere. You're going to be fine if you're on this bridge. The men would cross this bridge, and afterward they would talk to this lovely lady who was posing as the researcher. And she would ask them a bunch of questions. She would ask them the kind of design scenarios based around certain questions. And she would also give them her phone number to see if they had any questions about the experiment. And you know, they'd actually call her because she was a beautiful woman. And what they found is the ones who went over this shaky bridge and asking their questions and designing the stories that the questions were supposed to elicit, they were actually way more sexual than the ones who went over the not-so-shaky bridge. And they were way more likely to call the researcher if they went across the shaky bridge. So, shaky bridge equals more sexual content in their answers, and it also equals calling the researcher. Not shaky bridge equals none of that. And what the guys designing this experiment basically concluded was that if you get scared, you're walking across a shaky bridge and you get scared and your heart's racing and you're feeling kind of physiologically aroused in a nondescript way, they attributed this to the beautiful woman. And so they wanted to call because they thought they were feeling all sort of out of whack and heart racing because of her and not necessarily because of the shaky bridge. So we really have no idea why we do what we do. And so what psychology can do in the Asch experiment and this experiment, it really allows you to tease apart all of these factors without our own intuition getting in the way. And that's the value of psychology you'll see throughout most of the cool experiments. This is what they're doing. They're figuring out why we do what we do and not letting our own feelings and intuitions about that get in the way.
Every day, a sea of decisions stretches before us. Some are small and unimportant, but others have a larger impact on our lives. For example, which politician should I vote for? Should I try the latest diet craze? Or will email make me a millionaire? We're bombarded with so many decisions that it's impossible to make a perfect choice every time. But there are many ways to improve our chances, and one particularly effective technique is critical thinking. This is a way of approaching a question that allows us to carefully deconstruct a situation, reveal its hidden issues, such as bias and manipulation, and make the best decision. If the critical part sounds negative, that's because, in a way, it is. Rather than choosing an answer because it feels right, a person who uses critical thinking subjects all available options to scrutiny and skepticism. Using the tools at their disposal, they'll eliminate everything but the most useful and reliable information. There are many different ways of approaching critical thinking, but here's one 5-step process that may help you solve any number of problems. 1. Formulate your question. In other words, know what you're looking for. This isn't always as straightforward as it sounds. For example, if you're deciding whether to try out the newest diet craze, your reasons for doing so may be obscured by other factors, like claims that you'll see results in just 2 weeks. But if you approach the situation with a clear view of what you're actually trying to accomplish by dieting, whether that's weight loss, better nutrition, or having more energy, that'll equip you to sift through this information critically, find what you're looking for, and decide whether the new fad really suits your needs. 2. Gather your information. There's lots of it out there, so having a clear idea of your question will help you determine what's relevant. If you're trying to decide on a diet to improve your nutrition, you may ask an expert for their advice or seek other people's testimonies. Information gathering helps you weigh different options, moving you closer to a decision that meets your goal. 3. Apply the information, something you do by asking critical questions. Facing a decision, ask yourself, what concepts are at work? What assumptions exist? Is my interpretation of the information logically sound? For example, in an email that promises you millions, you should consider, what is shaping my approach to this situation? Do I assume the sender is telling the truth? Based on the evidence, is it logical to assume I'll win any money? 4. Consider the implications. Imagine it's election time, and you've selected a political candidate based on their promise to make it cheaper for drivers to fill up on gas. At first glance, that seems great. But what about the long-term environmental effects? If gasoline use is less restricted by cost, this could also cause a huge surge in air pollution, an unintended consequence that's important to think about. 5. Explore other points of view. Ask yourself why so many people are drawn to the policies of the opposing political candidate. Even if you disagree with everything that candidate says, exploring the full spectrum of viewpoints might explain why some policies that don't seem valid to you appeal to others. This will allow you to explore alternatives, evaluate your own choices, and ultimately help you make more informed decisions. This 5-step process is just one tool, and it certainly won't eradicate difficult decisions from our lives, but it can help us increase the number of positive choices we make. Critical thinking can give us the tools to sift through a sea of information and find what we're looking for. And if enough of us use it, it has the power to make the world a more reasonable place.
Are you eating a credit card's worth of plastic every week? Probably not. But if you saw headlines like this, you might worry that you are. These days, trying to piece together what to believe can feel impossible. But we can still find reliable, trustworthy answers as long as we know how to look for them. You probably already know that you shouldn't believe everything you read, watch, or hear. On an internet where everyone is competing both for attention and to control narratives, it's no surprise that there are plenty of distortions, exaggerations, baseless claims, propaganda, and whatever this is. But it's also home to lots of good scientific information, too. So when it comes to something as important as science, how do we figure out what's reliable? Well, it helps to understand how a science story like this becomes news in the first place. See, that CNN article isn't the whole story. It's just the part we see as consumers of science news. That science news tastes bad. Think of it like the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on below the surface. CNN got the details from this report by the WWF. No, not the wrestling group from the 90s, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And they got it from a study they commissioned from researchers at Australia's University of Newcastle, which reported a range of possible amounts of plastic that people might consume in a week, from a high of 5 grams all the way down to 0.1 grams. But the WWF only reported the high end of the range, saying an average person could be ingesting approximately 5 grams of plastic per week, about the size of a credit card. And that technically could be true. It could be that much. There's a lot of things that could be true. It's like when an insurance company says, I could save you up to 15% or more on your car insurance. Up to 15% or more? That's all of the percents. So why would they do that? Well, different kinds of publications have different kinds of goals, and as a savvy consumer of science media, it's helpful for you to consider what those goals might be. Like, the WWF is a nonprofit advocacy group whose goal is to preserve nature through lobbying and research. So they might really want to sound the alarm about microplastics in order to bring people into their broader mission. Considering an outlet's goals gives us, as consumers, more information to consider. It gives us a broader context than just the story would alone. And while I would agree that microplastics are a big deal, only reporting on the upper range to make the situation feel more urgent and headline-worthy can make a situation seem a lot more dire than it actually is, and intentionally or not, be misleading. News organizations, by the way, also have goals that we should take into consideration, like the goal to get a lot of people to click on an article, and a headline that says you might eat between 1/10 of a gram and 5 grams of microplastics every week is not going to get the clicks. What gets reported in the news is sometimes different from the information in the primary source, the first-hand account from the scientists who actually conducted the study. The primary source is the most accurate representation of what the scientists who conducted the research actually found. In this particular instance, the primary source was the study from the researchers at Newcastle who reported a range of possible amounts of plastic ingestion. So what happened between the primary source and CNN? Well, the Newcastle team got their results and shared them with the WWF. It was then written into a report by consultants who had not conducted the research directly in what we would call a secondary source. And this secondary source only listed the upper range of plastic we could be eating. Those are the numbers that got picked up by CNN. In science, news articles are often tertiary sources. They summarize the information of primary and secondary sources and are usually not written by scientists. Sometimes when science gets reported, it can also get distorted. Sometimes it's an honest mistake. Someone somewhere along the way got their facts mixed up. We call that misinformation. Information that is wrong or misleading. But because, as the kids say, we live in a society, we also have to worry about disinformation. Information that is intentionally misleading or false. But here's the thing. None of this means that we have to stop trusting reputable news organizations or even advocacy organizations like the WWF wholesale. It just means we need to be more diligent when we are consuming news. And good science journalists have learned to navigate the scientific community. They often have experts they can reach out to for second opinions, and they present useful context behind a story to help the reader understand how the news fits into larger conversations in science. So, what does this mean for us? How can we, as non-scientists and non-journalists, dig down and figure out when a story is reliable and when it isn't?
That's the key, Hank. You don't dig, you sift. It's a way of evaluating sources developed by digital literacy expert Mike Caulfield from the University of Washington. The S stands for stop. Stop. When you see something that triggers a strong emotional response, you should stop and really think about what you're reading.
So don't immediately text everyone I know and tell them that they could book a flight with all the microplastics inside of them. Got it. What's next?
Investigate the source, the place that published the information. Who's putting it out there and why? In this case, we're looking at CNN. How do we find out if CNN is a reputable source? Well, we know they've been around for over 40 years. But let's investigate a bit further. So let's open a new tab and get the scoop on CNN. It looks like they're in the green zone on this media bias chart from Harvard Library's research guides. We call this strategy lateral reading, checking other websites, newspapers, and media guides like this one to make sure that the source you're getting the original information from is on the up and up.
So if the original source is trustworthy, then we're good?
Not yet. Up next is F. Find better coverage. Using those same lateral reading skills, we need to check if other sources are reporting the same thing. What are other outlets reporting? In this case, we can find some other sources citing the credit card stat. But we can also find reputable sources saying that it's misleading. If other reputable sources are disagreeing, it's a sign to take the source you found with a grain of salt. If other sources are agreeing, then it's a good sign you can dig deeper into what you read.
So you've got to read not just beyond the headline, but beyond the first source, especially before you share it.
Then you won't be surprised to hear the T. T is for trace claims to their original context. This is a big one. Often when we see quotes or images online, they're being taken out of context. So tracing them back to their origin can help us figure out if we're seeing the whole story. In this case, the CNN article tells us that the credit card claim comes from the WWF article, which CNN links to. There we can see that they got the claim from this original study. And here we can see the information in its original context, which stated humans may ingest 0.1 to 5 grams of microplastics weekly. Not, you're eating a credit card! Much more nuanced. So the high end of this range, which was in the original report, is actually 50 times greater than the low end of the range. That's a lot.
So SIFT is awesome, and in an age where we're getting so much of our news from social media, it's more important than ever for us to be discerning about the information that we are absorbing and sharing. Like, you will almost never see a primary source in a TikTok video. That should raise immediate red flags and encourage you to start sifting. Also, ChatGPT and other generative AI tools do not pass the SIFT test. They are not trustworthy as primary sources. And I get it, fact-checking can feel like a lot of work. For me, the SIFT method is a great tool, but there are other fact-checking methods out there, and the one you use and how you use it is a personal choice. But reliability isn't. Some sources are just more reliable and more trustworthy than others, and our personal biases don't change that. Like, the WWF might be an organization that does a lot of good, but there's still an advocacy group which is going to advocate for a certain cause. And that might mean occasionally misrepresenting scientific information. The point is, anytime we're looking at any source of science information, we have to remember that reputation and motive are among the most important things we should be looking for when it comes to sources. There might be a conflict of interest, like with the WWF, or even an obvious lack of reliability or trustworthiness when we start sifting through our sources. Thinking critically about the sources we're getting our news from is one of the best ways to make sure we aren't consuming a credit card's worth of bad information every week. But it's not foolproof. Even the SIFT method will let us down sometimes. None of us are immune to bad information, but tools like lateral reading are some of the best shields we have against the tide of mistruths. And I think that you'll find that as you start to sift through the sources, the trustworthy ones will rise to the surface more often than not.